It's time for questions, reflections. All right, before we jump in, just taking a moment to reflect on green tea today instead of coffee, by the way. But it's taken in this whole matter of the aesthetic experience, right? Where Kant says a lot about aesthetics too, by the way, and we didn't get into that. So those of you who are kind of down my line of thinking of wondering more about the artistic expression, other ways that the world can be experienced, not though just by humans, like what about things in general? If we were to sort of liberate this tight definition, this image of experience as only a human thing or even just an animal thing, what would happen? What would that mean? Maybe humans can only create art, but can other things also experience aesthetic versions of the world? I'd like to think so. All right, enough of that. We're going to start with the Enlightenment. Question 1. In what direction and in what countries does Alberto characterize the philosophical center of gravity moving in Europe during the Enlightenment era? Check out, if you will, please, page 314. Now, philosophical center of gravity is, of course, his turn of phrase for it, but what he means by this, of course, is where is philosophy really kind of, imagine that a spotlight. Where is philosophy being spotlighted throughout history as we move around on the continent and it progresses forward and down certain branches? Keep in mind, though, philosophy is still developing in all these areas. We could say that the philosophical center of gravity in Europe, my scare quotes, not his, in the 18th century was in England in the first half, in France in the middle, and in Germany toward the end of it. So, okay, we're saying, in other words, that England with Hume and Locke and who was that other guy? Oh yeah, Berkeley. Right? They're all in this sort of British Isles area, right? And then we start to see things gravitate. We did Descartes and the rationalists first for, of course, obvious reasons, I think, in the storyline, but we really do see much of France giving way. Descartes is pushing, has really fathered a lot of the modern philosophical movement, but his influences and his followers after this as well. Of course, we talked about Rousseau, and I don't believe he's mentioned much in here, if at all, by Gaarder. But so many of the other thinkers that come about afterwards are here in France. We've got, of course, those like Montesquieu and Voltaire that is mentioned just below that by Gaarder. And so the French Enlightenment philosophy that developed afterwards is very important. You can read all about that again. But that should be taken into account in your answers. And then, as we already hinted at earlier, German idealism is going to rise up, having been unintentionally, let's say, brought to a head by Kant, having no intention perhaps of giving birth to German idealism. Nonetheless, he's the one who fathers it in. What attitude and developments were the French Enlightenment thinkers responsible for regarding the natural rights of people? We saw this on, page 317. Very next, flip over. Let's see, go to the very bottom. The French Enlightenment philosophers did not content themselves with theoretical views on man's place in society. They fought actively for what they called the natural rights of the citizen. At first, this took the form of a campaign against censorship for the freedom of the press, but also in matters of religion, morals, and politics. The individual's right to freedom of thought and utterance had to be secured. Remember, Rousseau again. Freedom of the will and all that stuff. We didn't go that deep into him, but we saw the echoes of that in Kant. They also fought for the abolition of slavery and for a more humane treatment of criminals. The French Revolution really was a bloody mess. I mean, if that is what we are going to assume progress looks like, is violent revolutions, I think that we can end up, everything then looks like a nail to the hammer of revolution. And that does not seem like a healthy approach to me to look at history or the present moment. So remember that individualism is on the rise, right? And so the group does not equal the individual. So no, a group is made of individuals is the idea here. You can both honor and respect a group of individuals while also really giving more attention to the individuals themselves. And so the rights of an individual are an important aspect here if we allow for morality to take this same sort of move as Locke started and others started doing. Morality to also follow some sort of pattern of law. There's a moral law, not just physical laws anymore, not just laws of physics, but laws of ethics are coming about now. Okay, on to Kant. What does Hilda tell her father she believes about Sophie and Alberto? Page 323. Here we are. Short dialogue. Important dialogue, though. The poor girl is totally confused. But she's only... You were going to say she's only made up. Yes, something like that. I think Sophie and Alberto really exist. We'll talk about it more when I get home. I'm going to continue that dialogue in a second, but we've touched on this. She's clearly devoted to this idea that these are existing beings. Now, we're going to have a lot more to say to this by the end of the novel, too, when we do sort of an overlook again, a backwards glance over the whole book. But let's go ahead and touch on it now. What is this to mean, then? If fictional characters, fictional anything, exists in the world in some form, then this brings up that question that I brought up before, too. Does that mean that they're real? In the sense that, so is this something we would call fictional realism, whereby simply creating a fictional character or thing and investing in it enough so it becomes an existing feature of the world in the sense that it's real? Or is there another way that existing things in the world, that fictional things or things that are not real can nonetheless exist in the world? That seems a lot more obvious and plausible to me anyway. If I said, oh, do you know Mario? You know, Mario and Luigi Mario. You'd be like, yeah, of course I know Mario. Well, Mario must exist in some form, right, for you to know what or who Mario is. It doesn't mean that he's a real entity, walks about on his own account and so forth. So we'll have to be really careful with how we think about Gaarder's book from this point forward. But keep in mind, as it gets stranger and stranger, we'll also have to see where is he going with this? What is he ultimately saying through this book that he will not detail for us out loud or on the page? Now, continuing that conversation, because it's important, as I said, we'll talk about it more when I get home. Okay, have a nice day. What? I mean, good night. Oh, good night. End of conversation. What a weird way to end the conversation, though. Why didn't he just say good night? Why did he say have a nice day? Oh, no big deal. He had a slip of the tongue, maybe. That came up before, didn't it? Slips of the tongue. What was that about? Huh. Fascinating. What is the difference between what Kant calls things in themselves and our perceptions of those things? Covered this pretty well, I think, in the in-depth look video, but let's go on and find a reference point. He says, as material beings, we belong wholly to the natural world. We are therefore subject to causal relations. As such, we have no free will. But as rational beings, we have a part in what Kant calls das Ding an sich. That is, the world as it exists in itself, independent of our sensory impressions. Only when we follow our practical reason, which enables us to make moral choices, do we exercise our free will, because when we conform to moral law, it is we who make the law we are conforming to. Again, if that's not completely clear, go back to the in-depth video and try and make the connections here between this, the business of metaphysics as a science and the synthetic a priori and its significance to that science, and then also what does that inform us of our cognition, the first principles of cognition, that we can then talk about moral law in this way as something that, like an object, both is is in a sense experienced in the world, but only by the means of appearance, and we can reason or think about those things, but it is not the same as knowing those things. And in the same way that moral law is there, it's in the world, and it conforms to, in some sense, what we perceive the world as, how it is we come to the world, again, by also a form of reason. Reason contributes to that way that we approach the world, time, space, and elsewhere. Time, space, and otherwise, all of that coming into play. Again, go rewatch that if that's helpful. But what I want to point out again is both Gaarder and Alberto, obviously, are bringing this up as rational beings. We have a part in what Kant calls das Ding an sich. So the das Ding an sich for rational beings is what? That is the essence of human being. It's the free will. And so it's because of free will that morality even matters. If everything was completely deterministic in the way that Spinoza talks about it, then what's the point exactly to morality? So here was Spinoza trying to build an ethics out of this very deterministic look of the universe, but it would seem to someone like Kant, perhaps, that such a thing makes no sense. If it's all completely deterministic and there is no free will per se, then morality is just a meaningless statement. It's just a nullity. It doesn't pertain to anything per se. It would be perhaps at best like a sort of illusion, maybe even a vulgar illusion in the way that Hume is describing it. But because he feels that, yes, we come to the world, and the world, and in its own way, comes to us and has to shape into our faculties the way it does, that moral law then is a requirement of both. It requires both the universe's part and our part to be composed. And so, getting back to the question at hand, things in themselves would, of course, again, be those objects. It would be the things prior to or beyond the perceptions, the appearances, and so forth. And then there are the things for us. There's the dharma as I actually experience it and view it, qualities and all. Nonetheless, it's still something that must produce those qualities, but I only have access to the appearances. So the next question from Kant, what weapon does Alberto believe he and Sophie have against Hilda's father? So this is back in the Enlightenment chapter, isn't it? And so what's going on here? About midway down, Alberto says, it may be that Hilda's father knows everything we do. It may be just as difficult to escape his omniscience as it is to run away from your own shadow. However, and this is where I have begun to devise a plan, it is not certain that the Major has already decided on everything that is to happen. He may not decide before the very last minute, that is to say, in the moment of creation. Precisely at such moments we may possibly have an initiative of our own, which guides what we say and do. Such an initiative would naturally constitute extremely weak impulses compared to the Major's heavy artillery. We are very likely defenseless against intrusive external forces, such as talking dogs, messages, and bananas and thunderstorms booked in advance, but we cannot rule out our stubbornness, however weak it may be. Jump a bit. The trick would be if we could manage to do something all on our own, something the Major would not be able to discover. All right, so there's, hopefully you can see the interplay here between what Alberto is planning to do, thinks there may be a way out of this mess. How does this relate to Kant? The Ding an sich, the rational being as such that has, at its essence, a freedom of will. If I made this dharma, it's still a thing out there, in a sense, right? It is something that I don't have direct access to, even though I made it. To say that you know a thing, then, even to have made something doesn't give you that sort of, that privilege of access, does it? So that would mean that whether it was a, ceramic dharma doll, or a fictional character in a novel I'm writing, I would not, perhaps, assuming it's real in some way, have complete access to it. I would be unable to know it to the same depth and level that I say perhaps know myself as my own Ding an sich. So what's the deal? The deal is that Alberto is realizing that if they are in any sense at all, things only maybe from, but not completely of Albert Nag's mind, Hilda's father's mind, that is, though he brought them into being, just like your mother brings you into being, you are not as much as you may be the creation of your parents, you are not them, right? In this same way, could we say that Sophie and Alberto and everything else that Hilda's father has written into the story so far are things from him, but not of him? Can they possibly, if they exist in the fashion that Hilda is speaking of, could they, that is, maybe if they are real, could they have any of what makes us real, makes us Ding an sich, die Dinge an sich, that make us things in ourselves, that make anything a thing in itself. In essence, a character, a person with a free will. Maybe there's hope for them. So one more page here, page 338, fast forwarding a bit. After they've discussed Kant and the Ding an sich and so forth, here Alberto says, I said I had a plan. As long as we stick to our reason, he can't trick us. Because in a way, we are free. He can let us perceive all kinds of things. Nothing would surprise me. If he lets the sky go dark or elephants fly, I shall only smile. But 7 plus 5 is 12. Synthetic a priori. That's a fact that survives all his comic strip effects. Philosophy is the opposite of fairy tales. I do love that statement, by the way. Philosophy is the opposite of fairy tales in some senses, except I would go one step farther and say philosophy probably includes fairy tales as well. It's not science after all. If there is anything to take from Kant that I think is fairly accurate, while I disagree that metaphysics is at a loss for being useful or pertaining to things that, about the world, that is, that we can think speculatively about the world, I do think he's right about this one point, that it won't make for a terrific science in the way that we use science today at all. Philosophy isn't science. So philosophy as the opposite of fairy tales actually in a way doesn't even make sense unless you include fairy tales. But that's going off the deep end again a little bit there. Let us return to the questions. What titles are commonly given to Kant's brand of ethics, and why? We want to go just a couple of pages before to page 336. Towards the top of the page, only when you do something purely out of duty can it be called a moral action. Kant's ethics is therefore sometimes called duty ethics, and we talked about it, and we talked about why maybe even, and so forth. We've covered this. Sophie gives the example of, I feel it is my duty to collect money for the Red Cross or the church bazaar. Yes, says Alberto, and the important thing is that you do it because you know it is right, even if the money you collect gets lost in the street, or is not sufficient to feed all the mouths it is intended to. You obeyed the moral law. You acted out of goodwill, and according to Kant, it is this goodwill which determines whether or not the action was morally right, not the consequences of the action. Kant's ethics is therefore also called a goodwill ethic. I want to stay on this point for a little bit longer. So the direct answers to this question are duty ethics, goodwill ethics. Why? Because they are seen as things you do. In an absolute sense, it is absolutely right or wrong to do X, Y, or Z. And it is not for someone else to necessarily spell out, but someone could hypothetically do so. Importantly, we each do this for ourselves. We reason by way of the categorical imperative, and then we know what the morally right thing or wrong thing is. But it's also called a goodwill ethic, because The whole point is that you're trying to do the right thing. It doesn't mean that in the end, that the best possible consequence, because that'd be consequentialism, that the best possible consequence or result will come about. So does that mean you didn't do the right thing? No. The fact that you tried, that you have reasoned out what the right thing is to do, not based on consequences, but due to the very fabric of space-time itself and your reasoning capabilities, and you can't predict the future, so anyway, consequences shouldn't appeal to us anyway, says Kant. And you are then following through with doing what you intended to do. That good intention, that goodwill, is all that matters. That's what made the action right, not what happened because of it. Again, we can see lots of people want to push back against this. But you also have to give credit to how consistent this is, and also why it's such a hard thing to push back against. Exactly. You can't always put your finger on it. Doesn't it feel like, though, it should matter? Shouldn't the consequences matter? But do I have to be able to fortune tell? To see into the future? To know what those consequences are? Does probability theory or statistics give us any insight here? Does the probabilistic outcome help determine what the right thing to do is nowadays? We certainly don't live by complete Kantian ethics. Wherever we see, moral maxims and stuff like that, maybe in the courtroom. But I'd say most of us in our daily lives don't think this way about things. Not always. Sometimes we might. If you are a religious person, this doesn't pertain to my family, but I could still see, I have lived that way before in the past. I could see how you might decide on an action simply based on whether or not it was in the Ten Commandments, or in what the Buddha supposedly told you to do or not to do. So you could have religious reasons, but that's not quite the same thing, is it? That's not what Kant's talking about. He's asking for something. He's departing a little bit from deism in the sense that he doesn't think we can actually encounter God, or we cannot prove God's existence. We can't make existence claims in any way except through faith, perhaps. But he does kind of continue with this trend of that reason is endowed to each of us. We each are endowed with reason, and we can utilize that reason to find what the absolutes are of the world, morally speaking. We cannot find the metaphysical thresholds. We can't go beyond the metaphysical thresholds, but we can devise accurate moral systems for behavior. And you'll hear this as a constant debate. It is still going on right now. Does intention matter more, or do the results and consequences matter more? I have to sometimes side on Kant. I don't always, but let me defend myself for a moment. I think we do at times tend to go off too far in one direction or another on this argument. But right now, if there's anything that I've seen more of lately, it's this appeal to, well, no matter what you were trying to do, no matter what your good intentions were, the point is that the wrong thing happened, or the bad thing happened, which then gets equated with the wrong thing. What's wrong with that? I think what's wrong with that is, then people are not ends in themselves, are they? Here's another statement that Kant made that was so important, and I think we ought to really consider strongly. Does this not sort of align with our intuitions about people? That we shouldn't treat each other as means to an end? That I only wish to make a good philosophy course for you, so you'll pay me lots of money, and I get rich off. I'm not going to get rich off this probably, but this is why I'm going to use you to get to my end. And I'm going to make you feel great about all the wonderful philosophical concepts you can now retain in your head or talk about at a dinner party or something, so that I can make more money? Is that what friendship's about? Do you think of your friend as a way of just feeling good about yourself more often? That's all they're really good for? Isn't part of what makes a friend is that you care about them as an end, not as a means? I think Kant got something right here. And if he got that right, then the more we dwell on whether or not the consequences are what determine whether something was right or wrong, means that we ultimately can end up ignoring the individual and what they intended. And if we ignore what was intended, then really everything is a means. By looking only at consequences, it dawns on me that we are, and determining from consequences if things are right or wrong, it dawns on me that we are then saying that we get to those things being right or wrong by way of people. People doing the right thing ends in the right thing. In other words, it's specifically the consequence that we're aiming for, and not doing the right thing itself. Let me take this to a really bizarre example. Let me push this a little bit farther and see if this alights on anything. There's a famous problem called the, I think, universal paperclip problem. I believe it is. And the idea goes like this. Let's say we build an artificial intelligence of some sort, right? It's specialized, so it's not too, it's not far-reaching, but it does exactly what we've asked it to do, for the most part. And we've said we need more paper clips. Please produce more paper clips. That's the instruction. So what is it going to do? Well, we can assume it's going to produce more paper clips. And what if it runs out of the material we gave it to make those paper clips? Hypothetically, if it's still on a continuous loop, a while loop, as we call it, to continue to make more paper clips, then it's going to find other materials. Maybe it'll take apart houses. Maybe it'll take apart rocks. Maybe it'll destroy nature all over the planet. It'll destroy the environment in order to make these. It'll destroy us in the process. Maybe it'll actually consume the planet. And in an effort, let's assume that it could even keep going beyond that. In an effort just to create more paper clips, it could destroy everything. At least, within degrees, assuming the universe isn't infinite. So that seems bad, doesn't it? But it's getting at the end. The consequence. You wanted more paper clips. You're getting more paper clips. That's the consequence. That's the result you wanted. What was the problem? No values. It did not have programmed into it human values. Things that are important to us. Environmental values. What's important to the animals and plants and so forth around us, not just to us, right? There are no values in there. It should, we would hope, have an intention. If by intention, in this particular case, since it's not a human being, we mean maybe like the programming to do the right thing, to try and do the right thing, that's what we expect it to also do, not just produce the result, or else we get disasters. So if we are feeling a little repulsed by the idea of duty ethics right now, keep in mind that it's sort of arch nemesis, its opposite in consequentialism, doesn't necessarily offer a lot of promise either. And we do seem to be delving more into that these days, at least in popular culture. Things aren't the way they should be already. And so your intention doesn't matter here. It's whether or not we have the results we wanted. Of course, yes, there probably is a balance, provided we're not falling into that middle ground fallacy business again. We could say maybe kind of like this partial experience, partial rationalist, partial empiricist venture. Maybe there's some way in which we can uphold good intention while placing a little bit also in value, programming the value of what the consequence or result is. And I think that probably does make for a much fairer ethic. That's enough on my thoughts, but I do have to share more of these little Easter egg type things, these revelations, if you will. Page 306. Hilda, that's right. Hilda's the one who's reading the fiction then is Sophie, right? It says on page 306, when Hilda heard the knock on the door, that is her mom, she had no idea how long she had been standing there. But she was sure, she was perfectly sure, that her reflection had winked with both eyes. We are not done yet. And hopefully you also noted on page 307 how even though, indeed, her dad had found the gold crucifix, haha, it's still missing. Oh. Not done yet. All right, that's all for now. See you again next time when we talk about Romanticism, which follows the Enlightenment period, and Hegel.